And sir, with this bill, we're delivering on that promise.
I call the Honourable Member Dr. Rajin Prasad. Namaste.
Namaste, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to take a call on this bill, and as my colleague has already said, that we will support this bill to Select Committee. But I personally will want to be convinced at Select Committee that what's being proposed here it will achieve the goals that the bill has set out and will not do more damage to our most vulnerable families. Because the way this bill is presented, the genesis of the bill, the way these ideas were announced, were very cynical. It was at a time when the National Party's dodgy Sky City deal was getting a rough time in the media. And right in the middle of that, the Honourable Chester Burrows announces this notion of major fraud amongst beneficiaries, mainly the former domestic purposes beneficiaries. So it was cynical. It was a cynical way of introducing that. This is not part of a program to really address this issue. This was something that was whipped out of the air. And the way in which the chairperson of the Social Service Select Committee, Mr. Sam Lotoinga, the way he has articulated this bill, the provisions here, really shows that he's become a poster boy. He's become a poster boy for the punitive provisions of this government around the most vulnerable. This is just another step in a long line of steps that this government since 2009 has taken by heaping obligation after obligation on the most vulnerable, not really designed to achieve the best out of the most vulnerable, although that's the language the minister uses, but it's actually designed to really pander to the members of that particular party that are really hostile to benefits generally. All of the language is fine, Mr. Speaker, that welfare will always be there and will always support those who are most vulnerable. But the way this government has gone after the most vulnerable and reforms after reforms really demonstrates its true intent, and this one is no different. Because it doesn't identify very, very clearly that clearly this government is not worried about the amount of money. Because if it was, Mr. Speaker, it would go after the $1 to $6 billion tax problems we have in this country, and it would go after that, or it would go more harder for those who are tax dodgers at the present time. But it doesn't do that. It doesn't do that. It goes for the most vulnerable, because the rate of welfare fraud, the rate of tax fraud is 150 times more than the rate of welfare fraud. Now, so here it's not convincing that there's a major problem, because the major problem here is actually a moralistic one. There is something about the morals that we question the morals of those who seemingly take advantage of the welfare system. And this side of the House has no sympathy for those who abuse the welfare system. We have no sympathy for those. But the way in which it comes about also needs to be reflected on. And the way in which Sam Lotoinga really talked about welfare fraud just then amongst domestic purposes beneficiaries, the former title, really shows very little understanding of how this actually works, Mr. Speaker. And anybody who's worked in this area or knows this community well really knows how quickly it is possible to give to a person, maybe a mother looking after 2 or 3 children, who's dependent on a benefit, going through about normal life, and how quickly others can malign that as abuse of the welfare system, because that person might be wearing good clothes, might be having a drink, might have colour television, etc. And anything that person does that gives the impression that there is a relationship that that person has creates this notion of family against family. We begin to attack those who are trying to get on with their lives as sole parents, dependent on a benefit, doing the best they can, and doing those things that most people in this House would consider normal, forming relationships. So, and the Minister did say in his preliminary remarks that he was particularly worried about relationship fraud. And that essentially means that if you are a person dependent on a benefit and have children, you virtually have no rights to have relationships. That's what it comes down to. And what is the morality of that? Would we not want, Mr. Speaker, our parents bringing up children, a sole parent bringing up children, to have the normal relationships that any adult will have? Because how does it work? Just think our way through this, Mr. Speaker. If a person is a sole parent, having children and making the best, forms a friendship with somebody and may see that person a few times a week, then that may develop over a 4 or 5 month period into something a little bit more than that, maybe visits to the home. In another 3 or 4 months' time, there may even be a night that person might spend at the home of the person who's on benefit. Now, at what point does that become a relationship for which the other person, the person not on a benefit, is then responsible financially? At what point does that happen? Now, if this happens in the glare of public life, if you live in a neighborhood that is hawkish about others, if you have people who are hawkish about a particular person, then, Mr. Speaker, this creates an environment in which those bringing up our children in vulnerable environments, vulnerable situations, dependent on limited state funding, are really made more vulnerable by these kinds of provisions. Now, it's not as if there are no other ways of doing this. Every person on a benefit has a case manager. There are many, many opportunities for conversations. There are many, many opportunities for asking questions. And yet the way in which these provisions have been brought to the House, the way in which this is, the notion of relationship fraud is talked about in this particular bill, is something I personally find objectionable. And I personally find divisive, and I personally believe that it will set our families against each other. And this happens, Mr. Speaker, you know the environments in which your electorate survives in, where there are many more people in these kinds of situations. Having that being so, we do know what happens. So I believe that the provisions are awful. I believe they are not well thought through. What's more, it's gone on to criminalize the activity, so that the other person that a beneficiary is having a friendship with or growing relationship with is now accountable. And if he or she carries on in that particular situation for any period of time, and then if the amount grows, amount of payment grows, that person is liable to $5,000 of fine, liable to imprisonment. And when you compare that, Mr. Speaker, to the way in which tax dodgers are fined, there are any number of cases that show that for similar crimes, the vulnerable are sent to jail, the rich get home detention. And these are for amounts of money to the tune of 3 times more. So a welfare beneficiary with $70,000 crime, if you like, will be sent to jail for a year or two. 18 months, I think, is the case I'm thinking about. Whereas somebody with $200,000 to $300,000 gets sent home on home detention. Now, where is the fairness in that? When is this government going to address those kinds of things as well? Mr. Speaker, this is part of the government's program of welfare bashing. And in the Select Committee, we will want to see, what the evidence is. Now, I would have expected some of the members of the Select Committee to be much more aware of this. I can't imagine how Alfred Ngaro can support something like this, because he knows from his own work in the community about many of these families and how these processes develop. Mr. Speaker. And so I hope to see robust discussion, and I'm personally not supporting this bill after the next stage unless I'm convinced that the safeguards are in place, because I personally find this absolutely abhorrent. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Like we find you.
I call the honourable member Jan Logie. Tēnā koe, Ms Logie.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker.